Good afternoon. I'm Audrey Ronas-Tobin, Director of Marketing here at Co-Strategics, and welcome to the webinar, Shifting Trends in the Data Landscape. We want to make this webinar more conversational, so if you have any questions, please add them to the Q&A and we'll try and answer them as we go along. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end of the webinar too. Also, we are recording today's webinar, and yes, we will send you a link when it's posted. And now I'm excited to introduce you to our speakers, Jeremy and Matt. Jeremy Henry is Vice President of Engineering at Co-Strategics. He started his tenure as a solution architect and has since led the creation and growth of the data analysis and data science team at Co-Strategics. Jeremy enjoys solving difficult problems and democratizing the sometimes esoteric world of data technology to make it more accessible. We also have Matt Wehrman, who's Director of Enterprise Applications. Believing that data and curiosity foster a culture of innovation, Matt helps companies view their business from a lens that might not have previously been seen. When not working, Matt enjoys exploring Cincinnati with his family and supporting FCC, our hometown soccer team. And now, let's get started.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Jeremy Henry, and these are the shifting trends that we are seeing in the data space that we'll be talking about today. First off, we'll be talking about a shift from big data to the right data. Secondly, the idea of getting data value from minimal effort. The third one talks about how to bring about change with data, which is always a difficult undertaking. Next is governance, which has a bit of a bad reputation, but we'll talk a bit about why and what to do about it. And then we'll finish off with some risk metrics. So to get started, this first one is you don't need all the data, just the right data. So the shift here that we're talking about is that idea of big data. And in the past, the answer, whenever anybody asked you, what data do you need in order to do your analytics, the answer was always the same. We need all the data. And that's kind of the big data idea. And that's been really prevalent over the past couple of years. And now with some changes in technology and processes, there's some new thinking coming along, which is that maybe you don't need all the data, you just need the right data. So if we focus on value, we can see that the subset of data that you actually need might actually provide more value than actually bringing in all the data from the enterprise, from all your ERPs and vendors and third-party data sources. And so what's wrong with getting all the data, right? Why is there this shift in thinking occurring? And I'm going to paraphrase Milton Friedman here. If you're familiar with Milton Friedman, he's an economist, and he quoted that saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And I'm going to paraphrase that a bit to say there's no such thing as a free data warehouse. Because with any data warehouse, there's always cost and risk involved. And so you have things like DevOps and data ops, cheap cloud storage, and those are all the things that have made big data possible. But even with all those things, all those technologies, there's still going to be cost involved with bringing in big data. And that's because of things like your data engineering, your monitoring, you have to maintain the quality, tracking your metadata and active metadata, which is another new thing that we're seeing. So at some point, the cost that goes along with all this additional data that you're bringing in may cause that additional data actually to become a liability.
There have been a lot of improvements over the last couple of years within the data ingestion space with low code or no code solutions like Fivetran and Azure Data Factory. They actually make it possible to reduce the amount of time it takes to bring in data. So it's possible now to leave data where it is in either your ERP, third-party SaaS system, and ingest new data sources only when it's needed and bring that cost down because it's no longer prohibitive to go back to that data well when necessary. When we bring in all the data, we do run into that liability, as Jeremy was mentioning. We have that risk of data sitting out there in our data lakes or data warehouse and becoming stagnant. The data might become stagnant because a pipeline may break, a data initiative have been abandoned, low priority to fix those broken ingestion pipelines, or even a low priority to go in there and clean up that late data lake. So overall, then the data gets stale and we end up with a bunch of zombie data sets within our data solution. So then when business users try to go find their data, they can't find something that's good. So they end up losing trust, or they don't know what they have, or they can't see what's available. And again, they lose trust and they don't want to use the data solutions being provided. And as a result, we end up with a data swamp.
So the key thing to remember here is that sometimes you don't need all the data if you can just focus on the right data. The second shift, we're talking about good enough, really is good enough. So there's this word satisfice, and it's a really useful word. It's not a common word. I hadn't really heard it before, but it's becoming more and more prevalent and common in the data space. And the meaning of the word is you're finding a minimum satisfactory solution. So the basic idea here is you're trying to get the best answer with the minimum effort expended. You've heard that phrase, don't let great get in the way of good, right? So just, don't spend too much time, don't spend too much effort worrying about getting a perfect answer when you have a good answer right in front of you. And with satisficing, we might be lowering that bar even further, right? So to the point of like, don't let good get in the way of passable. Because if you have a passable answer right now that is actionable, if you have data that gives you an actionable answer right now, that may be what gives you your maximum value. So now keep in mind, we're talking about an analytics data space here, right? So there's that differentiation between an operational database and your analytical database. And your operational database is your ERP systems like your SAP, your NetSuite, your QuickBooks. It's used for things like financial reporting. So it does have to be exact. It does have to be perfect. But when you're talking about your analytics database, this is things like your data lake and your data warehouse. You're often looking for data that's more directional, right? So it doesn't have to be perfect to the nearest cent, as long as you're indicating if you're able to use that data to understand the trends and the direction of the data. And that's where that idea of satisfice comes in.
So for example, when we talk about the minimum effort to be used, for instance, putting together some data analysis or report on customer attrition during the pandemic, spending more time to try to get the data to fit nicely within the company's fiscal calendar may not be necessary, and just applying it to a normal calendar to get the answer faster. Or say, normalizing February within the data so it doesn't necessarily show a dip within the percentages that you're trying to report. Or if there's a certain demographic detail missing from a survey from, say, part of the country, like customer age is missing from California. So instead of throwing out or not using the data, we should be able to interpolate that, get some US Census data, and be able to approximate what that can be. Interpolations, estimates, stuff are okay in our analytics database because it's directional, it satisfies.
So this concept comes up again with that idea of TTV. So if you're familiar with TTV, this is your time to value. And this is one of those key metrics that you'll often see in a data project, right? So this is the measurement from the time that the business asked the question to the time when the analytics team can actually provide an answer. And you've heard the phrase like time kills all deals. And that's, I think, especially true in the data space where, time can kill all insights. Think about an insight that could be useful in January is probably useless if you can't actually get access to that insight until July. So that idea of being able to analyze the data quickly, get the results you need, and quickly deliver them to the decision makers in the business is often more important than getting it down to the exact dollars and cents. And another corollary of this is that idea of continuously meeting with your business users. So we're all familiar with things like dashboards and reports, right? These are often the outputs of an analytics or a data project. Those dashboards and reports should not be stagnant, right? You should be updating your dashboards and reports on a monthly basis, or at least every quarter, right? So meeting with the business users, understanding what their changing needs are, how the dashboards that they were using last month might no longer be relevant, and what additional panels or additional data or aggregations might be useful in the coming month or coming quarter. So, and that's another reason why you can't spend too much time trying to optimize a particular insight, right? You have to just deliver the insights that you have and then move on, that idea of satisficing.
So we like to start small in data projects. We want to start small and expand. Let's get the data to deliver one dashboard first, maximizing that time to value. Get that dashboard and insights to the business users to get them start thinking about what might be the next question. How is this useful? What else can we learn? What other metrics do we need to see to drive the business? So the reason why we only want to ingest the data we need up front, deliver that first set of insights, and move on and start working with the business, see what else needs to be brought in, what other insights do we need in data to move forward.
Right. So remember that term satisfice, and remember that good enough may really just be good enough. And this third one we'll be talking about is data is hard, but change is harder. So here's a study that was done in 2013, and this is tracking red meat consumption and mortality. And what they found is that substitution of other healthy protein sources for red meat is associated with a lower mortality risk. This is prescriptive data. It tells you, it not only finds the insight, but it also tells you what to do about it, right? And that's one of the key goals of analytics, is finding an insight that leads to a recommendation. That's that prescriptive data. And this is conclusive, high quality data. This is in a peer-reviewed study, and it tells you what to do in order to optimize your value. So I can give to the audience right now a database recommendation, which is change your diet to replace red meat with nuts, and you won't die as much. So then the question is, how many people in the audience today actually just decided to change their habits, making a sudden and permanent lifestyle change to their diet for the rest of their lives? And my guess is no one, right? I've probably convinced no one. I've changed nobody's behavior. But why not, right? I have the data. It's right here. I presented it to you. There's a recommendation that tells how to use this data in order to improve your value. And this is from a peer-reviewed study in a medical journal. And yet, it most likely had no impact.
Gathering, processing, presenting data doesn't always equate to change, because change is hard. You have to figure out how to change culture more. And that's not necessarily by presenting data. Here's a study, here's a review, I heard it on the news. So the question is, how do we get data into the culture? We have often seen ourselves in the IT space where we may notice an inefficient process, or we've done some root cause analysis that identifies things that should change in our group and our software development or whatever. And often those recommendations just sit by the side, because within our group and culture, it's hard to put those changes in place. So oftentimes nothing actually happens because change is hard. So how do we accomplish change? One possibility is to deliver data when it is needed, where it is needed. For example, here, Burger Lounge in the menu provides information where and when it is needed. Inside the workflow of ordering a burger, they provide a plant-based option for their burgers for people to choose at the moment, similar to how you'll see calorie information as well. It's at the point of decision that you can then change to affect your behavior and how you want to use that data.
And you could argue probably that Burger Lounge putting this information in their menus may actually be saving more lives than the folks who published the peer-reviewed study in the medical journal, right? Just because of how the data is being delivered, how and when that data is being delivered.
With our clients on BI projects, we like to try to activate the data and put it to where people can use it through dashboards, reports, text messages, emails, mobile apps, etc. The goal is to get that data to the decision maker where it can best influence possible actions at the point of action.
And along those same lines, keep in mind that first line managers make most of the decisions within a business. And that's just because there's a lot more first line managers than anybody else higher up in that business hierarchy, right? So as data analysts, we want to look for insights that can actually impact those first line managers. So we got to look for the channels and the workflows that those first line managers are using every day.
So, for example, we have a client in the transportation space. They have a goal where if they could save 1 minute, they could save $1 million. And this 1 minute is within non-revenue time. If they can optimize the non-revenue time and save a minute on average, they saved $1 million. And that's great. So there are reports and such for the CEO, the COO to how they want to do that. But that is with them where they can provide directional change for the company. But we want to provide, we work with them to provide data to the individuals, the first line managers who are actually doing the work, the revenue and the non-revenue work, so they can come up with the efficiencies in their day-to-day work to make it easier to save that time. So it becomes more scalable when we bring in a first line manager. So in addition to the C-suite people, we want to look for opportunities to bring the data to the majority.
Right, but at the same moment, we want to say we can't neglect those C-suite people, those CEOs, CFOs, et cetera. Because those top line people are the ones that are going to set an example for the rest of the organization. That's where we get towards that data-driven organization, right? A lot of that example setting really comes from those top-level C-suite people.
The top line leaders aren't focused on making data-driven decisions, then the first line managers aren't going to feel the freedom or the trust to do the same. So we really want to build the culture to be data-driven. Everybody should be looking at reports and data, how they can best make decisions to improve the working within the company.
So the takeaway here is that data is only half the problem, right? Getting the data might be hard, but then using that data to change people's behavior may actually be harder. So this fourth trend that we're seeing has to do with data governance. There's actually a couple of them here. Now, data governance as a whole, as a discipline, has kind of a bad reputation. When you bring it up in conferences or in meetings, you're often kind of met with groans or eye rolling. And there may be some reasons for that. I think as a discipline, governance is still a bit misunderstood, and in the industry, it's still a bit undefined. But at its basics, right, when you think about governance, it's really just a process for managing data within your company. And this is similar to other processes that you're probably more familiar with, right? So you have some of them here on the screen. You can see, you have an asset like money, and you have a process for managing that money, which is your accounting processes. And your code is an asset. It's managed through your software development lifecycle. Your building has some physical plant. Your people are managed through your HR processes. Very similarly, if you think about your data as an asset, it's managed through a process called governance. So the tricky thing here is, though, a lot of these processes like HR and accounting, those have probably been in existence with the business since the business was formed. They've always been there, right? So people are very comfortable with them. They're familiar with them. They understand them. They don't have to think about them. It's like riding a bike, right? You don't really have to think about it. You just kind of know how to do it. But as we're introducing this new process for governance, it's not so familiar, right? People aren't really used to thinking about data in that way. So they're a bit uncomfortable, right? People have to concentrate. They actually have to think about it, right? And that can be uncomfortable. It takes effort. So again, that's where some of that eye rolling about governance comes in. But we have to remember that governance is necessary for scalability. So, a very small company, a mom and pop shop, can probably get by without a lot of accounting practices or a formal HR department. But big companies really cannot, right? They need to have these processes in place in order to help unify and standardize across all their operations. And similarly with the governance process, you have to have that standardization across your organization in order to scale.
Data companies, for example, Nielsen Media Research, they're comfortable with data and data governance. That's the core of their business. It's what they do. But compared to other companies that don't have data at their core, it can cause confusion. There's no single framework for data governance. like for accounting, GAAP, the generally accepted accounting practices. In IT, we do have some security specifications like PCI for credit card data or HIPAA for medical data, which can be too heavy for what we really need for governance.
So the first kind of trend or shift that we're seeing with governance is you need to make it concrete, make it solid, and make it usable for the people who are impacted by it. So right now, people kind of, if you ask people what they're thinking about when they think about governance, it might be something like this all-powerful governance board, right, that are overseeing all things data throughout your company. And like this image here of the timekeepers, right? This is it's kind of a big scary concept in people's mind. And some of that's also because governance is a bit vague, right? It's usually defined in terms of things like data stewards and RACI charts and data policies, which not everybody might be familiar with. Or the only people that really understand them are the people who are working on the governance project or process itself. So we need to change that image in people's head or in our own heads, right? We need to think differently about it. We need to look at it through the perspective of the people that it's going to impact most, people like your data analysts, your data scientists, your data engineers. So kind of do this thought experiment, right? So imagine you're meeting with your data analyst to talk through data governance. And if you go in talking about RACI charts and governance boards, you're probably going to be met with some blank stares. And your data analysts, you really want them doing data analysis, right? You don't want them trying to interpret policies and RACI charts, right? So imagine instead of talking to them in governance terms, talk to them about workflows, the things that they do every day, the things that they're familiar with. And these might be for a data analyst, it might be things like onboarding a new data analyst, right? When you hire a new person into their group, or requesting a new data source, that comes up often. Or transferring data outside the company, right? What do you have to do in order to make sure that you're following all the rules when you transfer that data outside your company? So if you're talking about them, talking to these people in those terms, then it becomes more usable for them, especially if you put it in a format like checklists, right? So when you think about things like you got to make sure you're following your, the data standards or naming standards, right? Then you put that in the checklist, right? To make sure that the data is adhering to these standards. Or policies, right? All policies are really just things you have to make sure that you did, put that in the checklist. Or roles, right? Oh, you have to make sure that you've, done this audit. Well, put that in the checklist as well. So in the end, you're going to have a checklist or a workflow that's speaking the same language as the people that need to use it. So like we were talking about those data analysts and onboarding a new data analyst into their group, they're going to have checklists for things like you got to configure that user in Active Directory, and the person has to go through their training on the handling of sensitive data. When they've done that, you can check it off. They have to take a quiz on data standards to make sure that they've read them and understand that. Once they've passed that quiz, you can check it off. So at that point, you've made governance a bit more concrete, which is a big step towards making that governance successful.
So the second shift I want to point out is no longer thinking of governance as just security and control, but to thinking about it from a perspective of trust. People here, as Jeremy mentioned, they think security, control. But the goal of an analytics database is to provide a single view of trusted data. And the goal of governance is to manage the tools and processes that ensure that single view of trusted data. So data systems like MDMs, data models, security, quality, metadata, they're all working and aimed at providing that single view of trusted data. Nobody wants a master data management system. What they want is a single view of trusted data. Or they say, we got to have metadata, but that's so they can have a single view of trusted data. An MDM solution like Prophecy or Informatica provides a technology where data stewards and a process to review and manage the master data brings trust within the organization. And governance is the management of those tools and processes. So start thinking about governance in terms of processes and workflows, just like the process to manage people, code, and other assets in your company.
And that concept of trust is important, right? That trust is what allows management to share data across the different business units and roles within the company. And the trust is also what gives people the freedom to start making decisions based on that data. The third shift regarding governance is this idea of measuring. So governance as a process should include goal setting and metrics, just like any other process within your company. When you boil it down, governance does have three parts, right? You have to define the policies, you activate those policies through workflows, like we just talked about. But then that third part is enforcing those policies. So there is that enforcement component of governance. The starting point for that enforcement is in the form of metrics. So you need to identify what you're going to measure and how often you're going to be measuring it.
And you are measuring how well people are following your governance policies and workflows. For example, what percentage of new employees have completed the onboarding checklist? How many terminated employees still have data access? What percentage of your users have access to data catalog or the analytics database in the past month? Or how many data sets appear in your catalog without an assigned data steward?
And a nice side effect of putting some of these metrics in place is that people will better understand what governance really means to the organization and understand the priorities, right? Because what you measure is really what you get, right? That defines your priorities. So the more that people can see and understand these metrics, the less dread they're going to have when they hear governance, and the more that they'll embrace the processes that go along with it.
So again, the diagram we're showing on the screen, the arrow at the bottom there is the data that's being generated by the governance process that's being measured and generated. And we want that fed back into the data system. We want to be able to show compliance on a report and a dashboard. So everybody within the company can understand how the process is working and have trust and faith that everything is going well and how they're using data.
So if you haven't already started on a governance process within your company, how would you get started? And I would say by picking a data governance framework. Now there's many to choose from, and they're all different, which isn't great. If you haven't picked one already, Gartner does have a nice one, and that's one that I would recommend. And then after you've kind of picked your framework and jumped into the governance world, if you don't have a CIO or a CDO who can lead that effort, then you might want to find a consultant or a vendor that can help you navigate and implement the framework that you've chosen. So Co-Strategics does have a governance consulting service, and we can help you get started with a governance program.
Otherwise, without a newly formed governance team may spend 6 months of your project debating definition of governance and all the data and systems that fall within its purview.
So governance may be difficult to define, difficult to implement, but it gets easier if you make it concrete with workflows and metrics. And it is that management and standardization of your data that comes from the governance and the trust that follows once you've got that implemented that's going to allow your company to scale. This fifth trend that we're talking about is your key risk indicators, your KRIs. So this isn't so much as a shift, it's more kind of a reminder that you need to consider your risks. Now, security people probably don't need any reminders on risk. This is kind of what they do every day, all day. So if you're a security person, you can probably just mute me until you see the slide change. You've probably heard all this before. But for everybody else, risk is something that you can't forget about, and you have to measure it, right? So again, we're talking about data and analytics, and risk needs to be a part of that. So there's actually a separate term for it, right? KRIs, it's similar to KPIs, whereas your KPIs are measuring your more standard metrics that most people are usually already familiar with, things like your revenue, your expenses, your profit margin, your efficiency. Those are things that would go on your KPI side. Your KRI side, which is your risk, is anything that might prevent you from accomplishing your goals. So the things that might throw a wrench and mess up your KPIs, that's where the KRIs come in. Now, where do you find these risk elements? Usually you can find them in your SWOT analysis. If your company does SWOT analysis, and if you're familiar with SWOT, this is where your company analyzes their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Those items that show up in your threats column usually are the things that you would want to measure as part of your risk. And sometimes weaknesses, you can find them there as well, but a lot of times it's going to be your threats. Some examples of these might be things like staff satisfaction or the sales growth of your primary competitor. They could also be macroeconomic indicators, things like inflation or unemployment. Those things can also have an impact on your business and your ability to succeed. So these types of things that I mentioned aren't usually common in data warehouses or dashboards. You have to put them there, right? You have to really think intentionally about what are the risk factors, how to measure it, and then you got to get it into your analytics system, because those KRIs are just as important to your company's success as the KPIs.
So some examples, some that Jeremy mentioned that you can't control, like inflation and unemployment, and also competitor sales. You may be able to indirectly try to affect them by lowering your prices. Instead, you need to control your response to those risks. So examples like increasing cash reserves, keeping additional raw material on hand to avoid supply chain problems. And then we can track the responses with metrics such as cash on hand and days of raw material.
Now, you can't get too carried away. You can't consider all risks or every risk that could possibly impact your company. Keep in mind that that K in your KRI stands for key, right? So you just want to focus on those key risk indicators, those KRIs that are affecting your business in particular. So those were the 5 primary shifts that we're currently seeing in the data space we want to share with you today. Some of these you may have seen yourself, or maybe you've already incorporated them into your strategy, which is great. And you may be seeing some shifts in the data space that we didn't mention, that you didn't see here at all today. I do want to mention that there is a follow-on. There's some more tactical data trends, like using synthetic data for AI and ML, that Matt and I will be presenting at a future webinar, so keep an eye out for that.
But before that happens, I do want to invite you to our next Co-Strategics webinar, which will be on November 10th. The topic is Data Analytics Jargon Demystified. Along with my colleague Nan, we'll be exploring definitions of the latest terminology and how they're different and when you may or may not want to use them within your data infrastructure.
And a little bit about us. Co-Strategics is a strategic technology consulting and implementation company, and we work to bridge the gap between technology and business teams. So if you're looking for guidance on how to mature your data analytics capabilities, we can help. Matt and I are in the data and AI solutions group, and this slide shows some of the services that we work on. But the real benefit of working with Co-Strategics is the partnership that we bring for co-innovation. So we work with your team to deliver speed and value on your data projects. Now, yeah, if there's any questions, Audrey?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy and Matt. That was really great information. We had a few questions come through. So here are just a few of them. And we still have more time. If you have questions, keep them, enter them in the Q&A or the chat. But the first question that came through is, how do you get started with governance? I don't want to boil the ocean. I really want to just take it one step at a time. What tool or tools would you use to implement governance?
Actually, I like that boil the ocean comment, because you really do have to start small, right? Can't get it all in one bite. And so some of that, we've talked a lot about security and control, like, security control, but a little bit got to kind of start there and look at what security controls in place. Then start looking about working our way up to see who needs what, where can we give the data, and how can we then set up those processes and make them concrete, as Jeremy mentioned. So starting small, starting some initial processes about access to data. How are people going to, readily activate themselves? How do they get access to quickly and securely to get the data and move forward and bring about their work? So starting small and working up to where you do have then a full data catalog and an MDM and a data governance council of stewards and owners who are really working to keep everything flowing.
Yeah, so there's not going to be like a single tool. Matt touched on tools a bit. So there's not going to be like a single tool that covers all your governance. It's not something you can just install and you're good to go. The governance, there are different pieces of your data systems, right? And Matt mentioned things like your MDM system, and that could be like Informatica or Prophecy, something like that for MDM. Your security is going to be through something like Active Directory. Your metadata is going to be through a catalog, something like a Purview or Calibra. So there's going to be all these different tools, and governance is going to involve the processes that manage all those tools, right? To make sure that those tools are incorporated into the workflows, like we talked about during the presentation, right? So identifying which of those tools are going to be impacted or overseen by your governance process, and figuring out how those workflows are going to be impacted so that, for example, as new data sets are brought into your company, whether they're third party or second party, they get added to the data catalog, right? And they're tagged with the right metadata and things like that, right? So again, it's going to come down to workflows and how to incorporate the use of your data process tools into those workflows.
Great. Another question was, how do you change culture? I don't want people to just stick with the same report, but how do I get my team to change and ask new questions?
So I was recently was on a panel at a conference talking about data culture and company, and it can be a little bit hard to change, and it's hard to work. And one of the ways I've done this with one of my clients is to, one, I say start small, but start getting the reports out there, that the whole organization can see. And then the data team starting to work with business, maybe operations, and start asking questions. Or you're in a meeting with some of them and they ask a question and you're like, oh, I have that data, I could produce this. And you kind of have to start winning them over, getting the hands in the people. For me, when it really, the switch changed is when we really got into self-service. When we, aside from our data warehouse providing our core reports, we made it accessible to people to start building their own. Once they had the data in their own hands, then it really took off. And people really started asking more. But you really are trying to get that flywheel going, to get a question answered, get it quick, get it turned around quickly, right? Your business has not acted the same in the last 2 years. So why should your reports, right? Let's get them asking questions and how we can improve and build upon the data we have.
And I come from a data perspective, right? So mine's more of a data answer, which is I think the culture can often be driven or start with metrics. Like I mentioned before, what you measure is what you get. So and that really needs to start at the top, right? So when you have your C-suite people that are looking at the dashboards, looking at the metrics, questioning the metrics, asking how we can improve the metrics, that's really going to set the tone and set the priorities for the rest of the organization. Now, again, it's a two-edged sword, right? So you have to be careful about those metrics because there are lots of unintended consequences, and there's several really good books about unintended consequences. So that idea of a balanced scorecard, right? So you have to always imagine what behaviors a particular metric is going to drive, and then figure out what metrics you can also use to offset those unintended behaviors. But I think metrics is a great place to start as far as culture change.
And the last question that we have here right now is, what do you do if your data is already a swamp? Do you try and start over, or do you try and clean it up?
From my perspective, it's put on the waders and jump, start cleaning it up. I mean, you are kind of having to start over too, but going back to governance, it's, we got to ask the questions, what data do I have? Is it accessible? Is it safe? And stuff in your data warehouse is being a risk that needs to be removed. So it's not really safe. And so for me to get started, it's almost getting down to cataloging. What do I have? Not necessarily say go out, with either Purview or Microsoft's Purview product or Informatica and just start trying to build out the big catalog. You can do it in other ways by either through AWS or Azure, using their APIs to say what are all my storage accounts, what cloud storage do I have? Just looking at your assets and start asking questions. What is this? What is this? Who owns it? And being able to go through and find out what's live, what's still active, and just start labeling and moving things. And so we can actually then start going through and purging and cleaning things out. But from my perspective, it's looking a way to audit your storage accounts and resources, start cataloging, assigning owners, and making sure they own it and keep it up. And then that's where we talked about metrics, data metrics feeding back in to your data platform. These metrics about, what assets you have, what data, how old data is, can feed back in and provide a view of your data risk.
Yeah. And again, I come at that from the same perspective, which is like Matt touched on. It comes down to metrics. So the idea of, you can take out of your catalog what's the list of all the data sets, the key data sets, if you want to start there, that exist in your data lake or in your data warehouse, and identify metrics against each one of those. And some of them are very Boolean, like, does it have a data steward, and has he signed off on it recently, right? Things like that. But you can also say, when was the last time the ingestion was successful? When was the last time the validations passed, right? And there's also a subjective idea to it, right? And we talked about trust as one of the key pieces of like a governance processes, but it's also something that you can measure, right? You can actually put out surveys. You can ask your data users, how much do you trust the data here? And the more people see that the data is trusted, the more they're going to be willing to use it, right? So don't ignore metrics simply because they're subjective. Subjective data is still useful, even if it's not objective, right? If it's not hard, real world measurable, you can still measure subjective attitudes towards those data. So imagine a portfolio where you've listed all your key data sets and you have these metrics against each one about how current is it, whether it's been validated. Now people can start to get a view for which of these data sets are useful, up to date, trusted, versus which ones are stagnant, haven't been updated, the pipeline's broken, things like that. That gives an idea to your business users, which ones they can immediately start using, and also to your data engineers about where their priorities are, right? Which ones are broken, if they need to be cleaned up or removed. And removal is always an option, right? You can just take it out of your data lake, take it out of your data warehouse, send out a note to all your business users to say, this has been removed. We'll get it back in if people request it enough. But that's also an option.
Well, that concludes our webinar today. Thank you for joining us, and please don't hesitate to reach out to Jeremy, Matt, or me if you have any other questions. Have a great rest of your day.